It all started with a casual conversation, one that didn't seem to mean much at first. My girlfriend, Sarah, had been stressing about getting into this elite program at a top university for months. She'd prepped endlessly, poring over textbooks and late-night study guides. It was a competitive program, practically impossible to get into without an impressive application, and she was borderline on some of the key requirements. She was worried, obsessively checking her email, waiting for the results. I was right there beside her, rooting her on. So when Sarah called me that afternoon, telling me she got in, I was over the moon. But that excitement didn't last long. At first, nothing seemed off. We celebrated over a small dinner at her place, the kind of evening where we could both unwind, laugh, and look forward to what was coming next. But it was when she mentioned her meeting with one of the faculty members, a specific professor who oversaw the admissions, that something clicked in the back of my mind. I didn't press her on it at first. She casually brought up how the professor, Dr. Whitman, had guided her through some last-minute adjustments to her application. She mentioned meeting him more than once, actually. Still, I ignored my gut, chalking it up to my own insecurity, but her tone, the way she described him, it was too familiar, too intimate. There was this undertone, something hidden beneath her words, that made my skin prickle. I asked her some general questions, not wanting to sound paranoid. She answered them smoothly, too smoothly, like she had rehearsed it. That's when the suspicion started to take root, creeping in like a shadow I couldn't shake. The next few weeks I tried to let it go, but the doubts just kept building. Sarah was acting differently. She was distant, distracted even. Her phone was glued to her hand, and she'd step out of the room more often when she got a message. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, she was excited about her new admission. But it wasn't just that. There was something underneath, a current of secrecy that felt so out of place. And no matter how many times I told myself to let it go, it festered. One night, I casually asked her more about Dr. Whitman. Her response was dismissive, and her body language changed instantly, crossed arms, a slight edge in her tone. I asked if he was helping other students as well, or if she'd heard how her peers were handling the process. She gave me vague answers, and when I tried to dig a little deeper, she changed the subject entirely, asking if we could talk about something else. My gut told me there was more to the story. This wasn't just about her wanting to avoid an uncomfortable topic. It felt like a wall she'd put up, one she didn't want me to look past. A few days later, I noticed she'd become more secretive with her phone. She'd angle it away from me, even for simple messages or notifications. When she left her phone unattended in the living room for a moment, the screen lit up, and there it was. A message preview from a contact, saved simply as W. That was strange. I'd seen her phone 100 times, and I knew she organized her contacts meticulously by first and last name, YW. The first thought that popped into my head was Whitman, and suddenly everything felt real. I wanted to confront her right then, but I held back. I needed to be sure. I needed proof. So, I decided to dig a little deeper. After that night, I couldn't let it go. The suspicion was now a constant gnawing itch in my mind. It was relentless, eating away at every ounce of trust I had in her. I needed answers, no matter what it took. So, I did something I'd never thought I'd resort to. I decided to check her phone. I knew it was a low blow, but the way she'd been acting, the late nights, the distant look in her eyes, it all pointed to something she wasn't telling me. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. She was in the shower, and she'd left her phone charging on her bedside table. My heart was pounding as I picked it up, feeling both guilty and desperate. I unlocked it and went straight to her messages. That's when I found him. W wasn't some harmless friend or random acquaintance. It was indeed Dr. Whitman. Their chat history was still there, a series of messages stretching back over the past few months. My stomach churned as I scrolled, reading snippets of their exchanges. It started innocently enough. He was offering her advice on her application, a few reminders about deadlines, some insights into the admissions process. But as the weeks progressed, the tone of their messages shifted. The compliments, at first casual, grew more personal, more intimate. Then I came across a message that stopped me cold. It was a late-night message from her, sent around midnight, thanking him for all the help and expressing her gratitude in a way that felt more than professional. His reply was coy, teasing even, saying she could show her appreciation in person the next day, and she responded with a winking emoji. A wave of nausea hit me, and I had to sit down to keep from collapsing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. I wanted to put the phone down, to walk away, but I couldn't. I kept scrolling, unable to stop myself. The messages got worse. They hinted at their meetings, vague mentions of times when they'd met alone in his office, and a couple of references to after-hours discussions. The implications were there, as clear as day, and the more I read, the more I felt like I was spiraling into a nightmare. My mind was racing. How long had this been going on? How deep did this go? I couldn't even comprehend it. Here was the woman I'd shared everything with, the person I trusted the most, wrapped up in a web of lies and deceit. She'd crossed a line with this man, this professor, and for what? To secure her admission? To guarantee a future? The anger was overwhelming. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and worst of all, powerless. Part of me wanted to storm into the bathroom right then and confront her, demand answers, demand that she explain every single message. But I knew I had to be strategic about this. Confronting her on the spot wouldn't get me the whole truth. I needed her to admit it, to see if she'd even have the decency to be honest with me. If I gave her the chance, would she own up to what she'd done, or would she lie to my face again? When she came out of the bathroom, I forced myself to act normal, to pretend like everything was fine. She smiled at me, asked if I wanted to watch a movie, and as I watched her settle down on the couch next to me, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. There was no trace of guilt on her face, no hint that she'd just betrayed me in the worst possible way. The next few days were hell. Every time I looked at her, every time she smiled or laughed, it felt like a slap in the face. How could she be so casual, so carefree, after everything she'd done? I was on edge, every nerve in my body wound tight, waiting for her to slip, to give me a reason to confront her, but she didn't. She carried on as if everything was perfect, as if she hadn't shattered my trust. Finally, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I arranged to surprise her at the university, planning to catch her off guard. I knew Dr. Whitman had late office hours that evening, and I had a hunch she'd be meeting him. So I waited in the hallway outside his office, hidden from view, hoping to catch a glimpse of them together. After about 20 minutes, I saw her enter his office, closing the door behind her. I couldn't see or hear anything from where I was standing, but my mind filled in the blanks. I imagined them laughing, her leaning close to him, that same look in her eyes that I'd once thought was reserved for me. The rage was boiling inside me, and I clenched my fists, trying to hold it together. Another 15 minutes passed before the door opened, and she stepped out, looking around as if to make sure no one was watching. I ducked back around the corner, holding my breath. She hurried down the hall and disappeared around the corner. Once she was gone, I felt a surge of anger and walked straight to Dr. Whitman's door, knocking hard. The door opened, and there he was. This man I'd never met in person, but had come to despise with every fiber of my being. He looked taken aback, but there was a smugness in his eyes, a confidence that told me he knew exactly who I was and exactly why I was there. I wanted to hit him, to wipe that smug look off his face, but I held back. I needed answers, not a fight. "What do you think you're doing with my girlfriend?" I spat, barely able to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms as if he had nothing to hide. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. "You know exactly what I mean," I said, stepping closer. "I know about the messages. I know about the late-night meetings. Don't play dumb with me." He smirked, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "She's an adult," he said, shrugging nonchalantly. "What we do in our free time is our business. Maybe you should talk to her about it if you're so concerned." I wanted to scream, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But I knew he was right. As much as I wanted to blame him, the real betrayal was hers. She'd made her choice, and now I had to decide what to do about it. I stormed out of his office, the anger bubbling over, barely able to see straight as I walked down the hall. I couldn't take it any more. My rage was a storm that wouldn't subside, a pressure building with every step I took toward Sarah's apartment. The mask she'd been wearing, pretending everything was perfect, pretending she was still the person I'd fallen for, had shattered. And now I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was done with hiding my anger, done with waiting for her to slip up. I was going to confront her and hear her lies straight to my face. When I got to her apartment, I found her lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled, the sight of her so painfully familiar that it almost made me hesitate. Almost. But the memory of those messages, of her sneaking out of that office, was too vivid to ignore. "Hey, babe," she said, looking up with that easy, casual smile she always gave me, as if she hadn't just ripped my trust to pieces. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stood in the doorway, trying to contain the rage boiling up inside me. "Sarah," I said, my voice strained, "we need to talk." The casual smile faded from her face, replaced by a hint of worry. She knew me well enough to see that this wasn't just a bad mood or a minor complaint. She set her phone down and sat up, watching me cautiously. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone suddenly serious. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know about Dr. Whitman. I know everything." Her eyes widened, and for a split second I saw a flash of guilt. But just as quickly it vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, as if she didn't know what I was talking about. "What are you talking about?" she said, her tone light, almost too light, like she was desperately trying to brush it off. "I saw the messages, Sarah. I know you've been seeing him outside of class, that you've been—" "With him," I said, my voice cracking with the weight of the betrayal. "How could you? How could you do this to me?" She looked away, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might actually deny it, might try to spin some excuse. But then she sighed, running a hand through her hair, and looked back at me with a hard, defensive glint in her eyes. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly, her voice laced with something that felt like resentment. "You have no idea what it's like, the pressure to get in, to be perfect, to do whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes," I echoed, my voice rising. "Are you even listening to yourself? You used me. You lied to me so you could sleep with your professor just to secure a spot. That's what whatever it takes means to you?" She looked away, biting her lip, and for a moment I thought I saw tears in her eyes, but it didn't change anything. I didn't think it would come to this. I thought it was just going to be a few meetings, maybe get a recommendation, maybe have a mentor in the program. But he asked for things, and I was desperate. You don't understand the competition, the stakes. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was sitting here, justifying her betrayal, acting like this was just some transactional mistake, like she hadn't shattered everything we had. I was disgusted, repulsed by how casual she was being, as if her actions were excusable because they got her what she wanted. "You keep saying I don't understand," I snapped. "But what about us, Sarah? What about everything we've built, everything we planned? Did that mean nothing to you? Was I just a convenience, someone to keep you company? while you went after whatever you needed." She shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "No, that's not. I didn't mean for it to hurt you. I thought it would be something I could keep separate, just a part of the process." "Separate?" I shouted, feeling the fury and heartbreak mixing into a storm I could barely contain. "This isn't something you can compartmentalize, Sarah. You slept with him to get an advantage, to skip the hard work, to cheat your way into something instead of earning it. And in the process, you threw me away like I was nothing." She wiped her tears, trying to steady herself. "Look, I made a mistake. I know I did, and I'm sorry, okay? I never meant for it to go this far." "Sorry?" I laughed bitterly, the word feeling hollow and meaningless. "You're sorry you got caught, Sarah. You're sorry that your lie didn't stay buried. But you're not sorry for what you did, because if you were, you'd never have done it in the first place." She looked at me, and in that moment, I saw her face twist with a kind of anger and bitterness that made my heart sink. "You know what? Fine. Believe whatever you want. But don't act like I'm the only one at fault here. You never understood the pressure I was under, the expectations. You wouldn't understand what it feels like to need something that badly." I was speechless. She was turning this around on me, trying to make me feel like I was somehow responsible for her betrayal, like I was the one who'd pushed her to make this horrible choice. I stared at her, feeling the last remnants of love and trust crumbling into ashes. There was nothing left here, nothing but resentment and betrayal. "Maybe I don't understand," I said coldly. "But I do understand one thing, Sarah. I deserve someone who respects me enough to be honest, to be loyal, and to stand by me, and clearly that's not you." She didn't say anything, just looked at me with that same defensive glare, her expression hardened into something unrecognizable. The person I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone who would justify her betrayal to protect her own ambitions. Without another word, I turned and walked out of her apartment, leaving her standing there in the doorway. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This relationship, this person I'd shared my life with, was gone. All because she'd decided that her ambition was worth more than my trust. As I walked away, I felt the weight of the heartbreak settle over me, a numbness filling the space where our love had once been. I knew there was no going back, no fixing this. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. In the weeks that followed, life felt like a hollow shell of what it had once been. Every little reminder of Sarah, the photos we'd taken, the notes we'd left each other around the apartment, even the mugs we'd bought together on that trip, felt like a fresh wound. I found myself drifting in and out of the days, functioning on autopilot, while the hurt festered in the background. The apartment felt empty, stripped of any warmth or comfort it once had. Sarah had tried to reach out a few times after our confrontation. A handful of calls, a couple of texts, even a long email where she spilled her reasons, tried to explain her actions again, but I couldn't bring myself to read past the first few lines. She talked about pressure, expectations, competition, everything except what really mattered. She'd chosen herself, her ambitions, over the loyalty we'd built. I didn't respond to any of her attempts to reach me. I didn't owe her any more of my time or my energy, and after everything, I didn't think there was anything left to say. I threw myself into work, into reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with, people I'd unintentionally distanced myself from while I was with her. They listened, didn't ask too many questions, and let me process things in my own time. I was grateful for that, for the quiet support, without the pressure to analyze or dissect what had happened. It was comforting, that steady presence of people who'd been there before her and who'd still be there after. One night, about a month after the breakup, I went out for a drink with an old friend. We were talking about anything but Sarah, just trying to have a normal night out, when he suddenly brought up something I hadn't thought of in weeks. "You ever think about going back to school yourself?" he asked, swirling his drink thoughtfully. I mean, I know it's not the same thing as what Sarah wanted, but you were always talking about picking up a few classes, maybe finishing your degree. I was taken aback, caught off guard by the question. I hadn't thought about going back to school in years. I'd always assumed that I was past that stage, that I didn't need it anymore. But now, sitting there with nothing tying me down, I realized he might be on to something. Maybe this was the time to focus on myself, to chase something that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. So I looked into it. The next week, I started digging into online courses, evening classes, even night school options that wouldn't interfere too much with my work. I found a program that fit my interests perfectly, one that could lead me into a new field, something I had always been curious about, but had never seriously considered. The more I read about it, the more it felt like a fresh start, a way to rebuild something meaningful without her shadow looming over me. One evening, I packed up every reminder of Sarah I could find, photos, letters, little trinkets she'd given me, and tossed them into a box. I was done carrying those memories around, done letting her mistakes live rent-free in my mind. It was time to reclaim my space, my life, on my terms. A few days later, I received a final message from Sarah, this time a simple one-sentence note. I hope you find what you're looking for. No apology, no explanation, just those words. And maybe it was for the best. There was nothing left for us to say, no way to mend what was broken. I read the message once and deleted it, feeling a strange sense of peace in letting it go. The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt hopeful. We'd only been living together for a few months, but things were starting to feel strained. Amy and I had moved in together after nearly a year of dating, thinking it was the logical next step. We split rent and bills, and the plan was to eventually get a bigger place once we were both more financially stable. She was still paying off student loans, and I'd just started a new job with a shaky income. Every month, things felt a bit tight, but we managed. Then, a few weeks ago, Amy started acting strangely. She'd get messages at odd hours and excuse herself to take calls in private. I noticed her dressing a bit nicer whenever she'd go out alone, even if it was just for errands. When I'd ask about it, she'd brush it off, saying she just wanted to feel good. Her explanations were plausible, but something was off. The real suspicion crept in when she started talking about wanting to move to a better place, even though we both knew our budget was already stretched thin. She would drop little hints about apartments she'd seen online, showing me listings for upscale places that were way beyond what either of us could realistically afford. Every time I'd ask how we could make it work financially, she'd just say something vague like, "I have a plan, I'm working on it." And I couldn't shake this feeling that I was missing something. Then came the weekend she told me she'd be working on a project all weekend and would probably be out late both nights. She made it sound like an important opportunity she couldn't pass up, something that would boost her career and help us with money in the long run. She left early Saturday morning, looking as polished as if she was going to a job interview. My gut told me something was wrong, so I decided to see for myself what she was really up to. That night, I waited until she'd been gone for a few hours. Then I drove over to the area where I thought she might be. She hadn't told me the exact location, but she'd once let slip a part of town where she met with clients. I drove around, hoping for a hint, an idea of what was really going on. Around midnight, I saw her car parked outside a high-rise luxury apartment complex, a place miles out of our league. There was no mistaking her car, the same dent on the passenger door that she'd been meaning to fix for months. But what really caught my attention was the man she was with, the one I'd seen her laugh and joke with at a few parties, our realtor. He wasn't just any realtor, though. He was the one who'd helped us get a good deal on our current place. He was charming, a smooth talker, someone you could tell prided himself on getting what he wanted. I'd never thought twice about him, even when he'd lingered a little too long after helping us finalize our lease. or how he'd offered to keep an eye out for properties we might be interested in down the line. I'd brushed it off as part of his job, the salesman charisma. But now, here they were, together at an apartment that we couldn't possibly afford, laughing and leaning in close as they walked into the building. I felt a sick pit in my stomach, a creeping anger mixed with disbelief. I stayed in the car, watching until they were out of sight. The pieces were falling together in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. My mind started racing through possibilities. What was she doing with him? Was she really going this far just to get us a place? Was she using him somehow to save us money, or was it something worse? The suspicion gnawed at me, relentless and ugly, but I needed proof, a way to confirm if my gut feeling was actually right. I drove home, barely able to sleep that night. I tossed and turned, wondering what my next step would be. The next morning, I was up before dawn, mind buzzing with questions. As I paced the apartment, I couldn't shake the image of Amy with the realtor. Everything about the situation felt wrong. That upscale apartment building, the way they'd looked at each other, her sudden obsession with upgrading our place. It was like I'd stumbled onto a trail I didn't even know existed. I wanted answers. So, I decided to start digging, beginning with Amy's phone. She usually kept it with her, but I'd noticed she'd left it charging in the bedroom. I hated the idea of snooping, but trust was out the window now. I needed proof. Unlocking her phone, I went straight to her messages. It didn't take long before I found a thread with someone named Mike R., the realtor. And the texts were disturbing, to say the least. They were casual, but laced with familiarity, the kind of inside jokes and personal comments you wouldn't expect between a client and a realtor. She'd sent him pictures of herself, dressed up, captioned with things like, "Will this help with the deal?" or, "Guess where I am tonight?" My heart pounded as I scrolled, each new message adding to the sick feeling in my stomach. Then I found the confirmation I was dreading. Messages from the night before read, "Mike, I've got the keys to the place tonight. Come by around 9, and we'll talk about making this arrangement permanent. Amy, looking forward to it. You always make things easier." I had to put her phone down. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. This wasn't just flirtation, it was full-on seduction in the guise of networking. The insinuation was clear. They were meeting up and she was using him to secure some sort of deal. But I didn't know how far she'd gone, or if this was just the beginning. I took a few moments to pull myself together, my mind spinning. I thought about confronting her, but I wanted to be sure of everything before she had a chance to lie or brush me off. I wanted undeniable proof, something she couldn't talk her way out of. My first move was to follow up on that high-rise building. I searched for it online, trying to find out if it was on the market or if there were any listings associated with Mike's agency. After a few minutes, I found it. It was a luxury apartment complex, and as I suspected, it was well out of our price range. The thought of Amy meeting up with him there, using her charm, and maybe more to negotiate something, made my blood boil. Desperate for more clarity, I decided to call her project into question. That day I sent her a message, playing along, asking how the project was going and if she'd be out late again that night. She replied quickly, saying she had another meeting with clients and would be busy again. Fine, I thought. If she was going to lie, I'd follow her straight to this project she'd been dedicating so much time to. That night, when she left the apartment, I waited 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. I kept a safe distance, my headlights dimmed as I trailed her through the winding streets. Eventually, she pulled up to the same luxury apartment building. She parked and got out, glancing around as if checking for anyone who might recognize her. I watched her meet up with Mike near the entrance, their interactions close and relaxed, too relaxed. They disappeared into the building, and I knew this was my chance. I waited a few minutes and then got out of the car, my heart racing as I approached the entrance. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't walk away now. As I hovered near the entrance, I saw a couple heading out, and I slipped inside, pretending to be on my phone. The lobby was immaculate, filled with designer furniture and sleek finishes that screamed money. I knew this place was miles beyond what we could afford, and it stung to think she was here, selling herself to this guy for access to a life we couldn't maintain. I checked the floor directory and scanned for any signs of where they might be. Then I heard voices down the hallway. I moved closer, straining to listen, my heart pounding. I edged closer down the hall, my footsteps quiet, as I followed the muffled sound of laughter and conversation. My stomach churned with every step, anger tightening in my chest. I was torn between wanting to catch them in the act and fearing what I'd actually see if I did. There was a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, and as I approached, I could make out their voices more clearly. I stood outside, just close enough to hear, but out of sight. They were laughing about something, and I could hear Amy's voice, light and flirtatious, in a way she hadn't been with me in a long time. I strained to catch their conversation. "Think you can handle this?" she said, with a teasing edge that sent a spike of rage through me. "You know I can," he replied smoothly. "This arrangement's working out, right? I get you the place. Sis, you... Well, let's just say I appreciate your enthusiasm for the project." I felt sick. This wasn't just some innocent flirtation. It was a calculated exchange. My girlfriend was making deals with this guy, selling herself to him for a nicer apartment. And the worst part was she'd been lying to me about it for weeks. I pushed the door open, my face set in stone, the anger and betrayal boiling over. They both froze, their expressions shifting from surprise to horror as they registered that I was standing right there. Amy's face went pale, and she stammered, trying to find words, but I was done with her excuses. "So this is your project, huh?" I spat, my voice barely holding back the bitterness. "This is how you're planning to help us move up, by sleeping with our damn realtor?" Amy's mouth opened and closed, like a fish, gasping for air, completely lost for words. Mike, meanwhile, had the audacity to smirk, clearly enjoying the spectacle. I could see the cocky satisfaction in his eyes, like he'd won some game I didn't even know I was playing. "Look, man," he began, holding his hands up in mock innocence. "It's just business. She wanted a deal and I—" "Shut up," I cut him off, my glare fixed on Amy. "I want to hear it from her." Amy looked like she might crumble. Her eyes were wide, her face flushed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first. Finally she managed. I was just trying to help us get a place, something better than what we have. I thought if I could make things easier." "By sleeping with him?" I asked, my voice breaking despite my best effort to keep it steady. "You really thought that was the answer?" "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, almost pleading. He offered, and I thought maybe if I did a few favors, he'd make it happen for us. I thought it would be a shortcut." "A shortcut," I repeated, disgust dripping from every syllable. "And you didn't think you'd need to tell me, or maybe, just maybe, not betray me in the first place?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment I could see real regret. But it was too little, too late. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and I knew then that whatever we'd had was over. There was no coming back from this, no way to rebuild the trust she'd torn apart so easily. I turned to leave, but Mike couldn't resist getting in one last jab. "Hey, don't be so harsh," he said with a grin. "She just wanted to upgrade her life a little. Nothing wrong with aiming high." I almost swung at him right there, but I held back. He wasn't worth it, and neither was this pathetic situation. Amy had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. Without another word, I left, letting the door slam behind me. I could hear Amy calling my name, but I didn't look back. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I'd built with her was a lie. After I left that apartment, the anger and heartbreak hit like a tidal wave. I could barely drive home, my mind spinning with everything I'd just seen, everything she'd admitted. I had trusted Amy with my life, my plans, and my future. and she'd thrown it away for a fancy apartment and a sleazy deal with a guy who saw her as nothing more than a quick fling. The next few days were a blur. Amy tried calling, texting, even showing up at my place, but I ignored every attempt. I didn't want her explanations or her apologies. I wanted my life back, the one I'd been building before she tore it down. At first, the loneliness was brutal. Every part of my apartment felt tainted with memories of her, the reminders of a relationship I'd thought was real. Our photos, her books on the shelves, even her clothes mixed in with mine. It all felt like a constant stab in the chest. But as the days passed, I started to see things differently. I realized that maybe this breakup was a chance to finally put myself first, to rebuild without the weight of someone else's deception. I began clearing out every trace of her from my apartment. The photos came down, the shared possessions got packed away, and I finally reclaimed the space as my own. I didn't need her things or her presence lingering like a ghost in my life. Every item I removed felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders, making room for something better, something real. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into things I'd neglected while we were together. I started spending more time at work, diving into new projects, and connecting with old friends who'd drifted away while I'd been so wrapped up in Amy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was rebuilding, focusing on things that mattered to me alone. Then one evening, I ran into Mike at a coffee shop. He was sitting there, grinning like he'd won some prize, no doubt confident that he'd gotten away with everything scot-free. Seeing him stirred up the bitterness I'd been trying to let go, but instead of confronting him, I simply walked past. He wasn't worth my time, my energy, or my anger. Amy had made her choice, and Mike was part of that choice, a part of a past I was more than ready to leave behind. In the end, the experience taught me a lot. Trust once broken is hard to rebuild, but I realized that I could move on, that I didn't need her or anyone else to validate my worth. It wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one I'd carry with me. A few months later, I found myself signing a new lease on a different apartment, a place I could finally call my own. It wasn't the luxury high-rise Amy had dreamed about, but it was mine, and that was enough. For the first time since all of this started, I felt free, like I was finally in control of my own life, my own choices. And as for Amy and her shortcut, well, she could keep it. I was done taking the easy way out.